Chapter 1. The Harvest Supper. It had been one of those late September evenings that seemed made to crown the summer and ease the village gently into autumn. Elmsworth, with its tidy cottages and mellow stone lanes, appeared particularly contented under the honeyed light of the setting sun. Windows glowed with lamplight, the hedgerows brimmed with ripe berries, and the faint scent of wood smoke curled lazily into the crisp evening air. The annual harvest supper was always a highlight in the village calendar, and tonight the church hall hummed with chatter, laughter, and the clink of cutlery. Long trestle tables, draped with clean white cloths, were laden with roasted meats, apple tarts, and preserves contributed by nearly every household. The vicar, the Reverend Pritchard, presided at the head of the room with an air of quiet satisfaction, while his wife fluttered about, ensuring no plate was left empty. Miss Jane Marple, seated a little apart yet never unnoticed, sipped her tea with a mild expression of approval. At 80, her presence was both familiar and oddly reassuring, a small, neat woman in a dove-grey cardigan, who never seemed quite as fragile as her years suggested. She observed everything, the flushed pride of young Mrs. Collins whose sponge cake had been declared exceptional, the nervous glances exchanged between Mr. Carter and the newly arrived schoolmistress, and the way old Mrs. Bantry's voice carried just a little too far as she relayed village gossip to anyone within reach. All was cheerful, ordinary, and blessedly uneventful, until the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. The newcomer stood framed in the doorway for an instant, a tall man in a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the season. His features were indistinct in the shadows, but his manner drew a sudden hush across the room. He did not belong, that much was clear. His gaze swept the hall as though he were searching for someone, and for a moment his eyes lingered on the vicar before moving swiftly away. Then, without a word, he stepped inside, boots echoing on the wooden floor. A murmur rose, curiosity, faint disapproval, a ripple of speculation already forming. Outsiders rarely came to Elmsworth unannounced, and never in the middle of the harvest supper. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully, her blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She had seen such entrances before, not here, perhaps, but in other villages, in other times. A stranger, arriving unexpectedly, often meant something was about to disturb the peaceful surface of things. The man nodded briefly to no one in particular, then crossed to the far corner where he took a seat apart from the crowd. Conversation resumed, though in a more subdued tone, and more than one villager stole glances in his direction. Mrs. Bantry leaned across to Miss Marple, whispering, "Mark my words, Jane, he's up to no good. A man doesn't turn up like that without a reason." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Oh, my dear Dolly, people often have reasons, some quite innocent, some rather less so. But you mustn't be too quick to judge. Appearances, you know, can be most deceptive." Still, as the evening wore on and the festivities wound toward their end, the stranger remained alone, silent, and watchful. When the villagers began to drift homeward, he slipped out quietly into the night. No one saw where he went. It was not until the next morning, when the milkman's boy stumbled upon a body lying lifeless at the edge of the meadow, a man with a knife wound deep in his chest, that Elmsworth realized the harvest supper had been the beginning of something far darker than any of them could have imagined. And Miss Marple, sitting calmly in her garden with knitting needles poised, already felt the first faint stirrings of unease. For she could not shake the memory of the stranger's eyes, searching, calculating, and touched with something very much like fear. Chapter 2. The Body in the Meadow. The morning after the harvest supper dawned cool and mist-laden, a veil of white drifting low across the meadows. From the church tower, the bells tolled faintly, as if reluctant to disturb the quiet. In most cottages, breakfast was already underway, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of kettles, and the cheerful chatter of children preparing for school. Yet by 7:30, peace was broken. Jimmy Whiles, the milkman's boy, came running breathlessly up the lane, his bicycle clattering behind him. He burst into the dairy with eyes wide and voice hoarse. "There's a man, missus, in the meadow, by the old oak. He's dead." Within half an hour, the story had spread like wildfire. The meadow lay only a short walk from the village green, and soon a small crowd had gathered, their boots damp with dew, voices hushed with both horror and fascination. There, beneath the outstretched boughs of the oak tree, lay the body of a man. He was well dressed, his coat unbuttoned to reveal a waistcoat, and in his chest a dark stain spread across the fabric, the unmistakable wound of a knife. His face was turned slightly to the side, features pallid, eyes half-lidded, as though he had been caught in some final expression of surprise. Constable Hicks, red in the face and clearly flustered, was already attempting to hold the crowd back. "Now, stand clear, all of you. There will be no trampling over the evidence, not while I've anything to say about it." The villagers murmured, shifting uneasily. Mrs. Bantry, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the mild morning, clutched her friend's arm. "I told you, Jane, I told you that stranger was trouble. Didn't I say so? And now look, murder." Miss Marple, who had joined the throng at a slower, steadier pace, said nothing at first. She stood quite still, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, her eyes intent upon the scene. It was not the wound she looked at, nor even the man's face, but rather the small, telling details. The angle of his shoes, one slightly mudded while the other remained clean, the scrap of torn fabric clinging to a nearby branch, the curious indentation in the grass a short distance from the body. Inspector Cray, summoned from the nearby market town, arrived presently in his motor car, brisk and businesslike. A square-jawed man with little patience for village gossip, he wasted no time in pushing through the crowd. "Right then," he barked. "Let's have everyone step back. No exceptions. Constable Hicks, keep them behind the gate." He knelt by the body, examining the wound with professional detachment. Single blow. Clean and direct. Whoever did this knew what they were about. "Do you recognize him, sir?" Hicks asked, wiping his brow. Cray shook his head. "No. Stranger to me. Any of you lot seen him before?" A chorus of voices answered at once, some hesitant, others eager. It was Mrs. Bantry, predictably, who made herself heard above the rest. "He was at the harvest supper last night. Came barging in, bold as brass, sat there in the corner not speaking to a soul. I said at once, didn't I, Jane? I knew he was up to no good." Several heads nodded in agreement. Others, however, seemed less certain. Young Mary Collins murmured that the man had looked tired rather than menacing. Mr. Carter claimed he hadn't noticed him at all. Miss Marple, when addressed directly, only inclined her head. Yes, he was there. A stranger, certainly. But if I may say so, Inspector, not all strangers are dangerous. Sometimes they are merely lost. Cray gave her a brief, distracted glance, the sort reserved for elderly women whose observations he did not value. Yes, Miss Marple. Thank you. We'll sort it." The body was carried away to the mortuary in the next town, leaving behind only the trampled grass and the uneasy hush of the onlookers. Yet the village itself was already buzzing with speculation. Who was the man? Why had he come to Elmsworth? And, most disturbingly, who among them had reason to drive a knife into his heart? By midday, gossip had spread to every corner. In the post office, Mrs. Finch declared she was sure he must have been some escaped criminal. At the inn, Mr. Hardcastle swore he'd seen the fellow near the railway station the previous week. And at the vicarage, poor Mrs. Pritchard worried aloud that the church would be talked about for years as the site of scandal. Only Miss Marple remained calm, though her knitting needles clicked a shade faster than usual. She had noticed something others had not, the faint scent of tobacco clinging to the man's coat, not the sort smoked in Elmsworth, but a stronger, foreign blend she recalled from her nephew Raymond's friends in London. And there was also the curious way his hands were calloused, not like a gentleman's at all, but like a man accustomed to rough work. That afternoon, she received a quiet visit from Dolly Bantry, still flushed with excitement. "Well, Jane, what do you think? Was it robbery? Or some dreadful love affair gone wrong? I simply cannot rest until I know." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Dolly, it is far too soon to know. One must listen carefully, you see, and watch how people behave when they think they are not observed. The smallest thing, a word, a look, can tell you far more than grand theories." She paused, her eyes thoughtful. "But one thing is certain, this is no random misfortune. Someone in Elmsworth knows precisely why that man came here. And before long, they will betray themselves, if only one is patient enough to see it." Outside, the mist had lifted, leaving the village bathed in autumn sunlight. Yet to those who lived there, Elmsworth no longer seemed quite so peaceful, nor its hedgerows so comforting. For a shadow had fallen across their lives, and with it came the uneasy knowledge that murder had walked among them. And it would not be the last time Miss Marple's sharp, quiet eyes would notice the truth hidden beneath the whispers of her little village. Chapter 3. The Stranger's Identity. Inspector Cray returned to Elmsworth the following morning, his presence as brisk and unwelcome to the villagers as a cold draught through a half-open door. The constable had posted notices asking for information, though everyone in the village insisted they knew nothing beyond what had already been said. The man had arrived at the harvest supper, sat apart, and slipped away without a word. Yet Cray was determined. "A man does not appear from nowhere," he declared at the inn, his voice carrying across the common room where villagers had gathered under the pretext of buying supplies or taking refreshment. "Someone, somewhere, saw him, spoke to him, or knows who he was. And I mean to find out." The innkeeper, Mr. Hardcastle, shuffled uncomfortably behind his counter. "Well, sir, I won't swear to it, but I'd say I saw the fellow near the station, a fortnight ago. Didn't think much of it then. He wasn't dressed like a vagrant, more like a commercial traveller. Smartish coat, though the boots were worn." Cray seized upon this. "Did he speak? Ask for a room?" "No, sir. Just loitered a bit, smoking a pipe." The mention of smoking pricked Miss Marple's attention where she sat in her quiet corner, knitting bag at her side. She said nothing, but her eyes glimmered as she filed away the detail. By midday, the inspector had arranged for the dead man's pockets to be examined thoroughly. The search produced curious results: a small notebook, worn at the edges, containing only half a dozen entries in a cramp hand. One was an address in London, crossed through. Another was the name Mrs. L, followed by Elmsworth. And most intriguingly of all, tucked between the pages was a railway ticket, purchased only the day before, from Paddington to Elmsworth. The news spread with dizzying speed. Who was Mrs. L? Half the village insisted they must know. Mrs. Bantry, flushed with the importance of discovery, declared triumphantly at the grocer's, "It can only mean Mrs. Lytton. Why, she lives up on the hill, doesn't she? And she has the sort of past that makes one wonder." "Now, Dolly," Miss Marple said gently when her friend repeated the theory over tea that afternoon, "we must be cautious. You remember the case of poor Mrs. Bartlett, accused of theft because of a carelessly dropped handkerchief? Appearances can lead one astray." Still, the speculation grew. Mrs. Lytton was a widow of some standing, not overly popular in the village, for she carried herself with an aloofness that seemed to suggest she thought herself above her neighbours. She had lived in Elmsworth barely 2 years, having come from London after her husband's sudden death. It was perhaps inevitable that Inspector Cray would knock upon her door before the day was done. Miss Marple, on her way to post a letter, happened to pass along the lane at that very moment. She observed the inspector's stiff back as he waited, and the slight delay before the door opened. Mrs. Lytton herself appeared, elegant in a dark gown, her face pale but composed. "Mrs. Lytton?" Cray asked, his tone formal. "Yes. What is this about?" "I'm making inquiries into a man who was found dead yesterday morning, here in the village. We believe he attended the harvest supper. Do you know this man?" For the briefest instant, Miss Marple thought she saw the woman's composure falter, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps alarm. But almost at once it was gone. "No," Mrs. Lytton said firmly. "I cannot say I do. A dreadful business, I hear, but I know nothing of it." Cray pressed her. "Your name was found in his notebook." "Was it? Then there is some mistake. I assure you, Inspector, I am entirely unacquainted with the gentleman." Her denial was smooth, but Miss Marple, watching from across the lane, caught the tiniest tremor in her hand as she closed the door. It was the tremor, not the words, that lodged in the old lady's mind. That evening, at the vicarage, the Reverend Pritchard expressed grave concern over the effect the murder was having upon the parish. "It is most disturbing," he sighed, stirring his tea. "The congregation is unsettled. Attendance at the Mothers' Union has already dropped. People are frightened." Frightened or thrilled? Miss Marple asked softly. The vicar blinked. "My dear Miss Marple, this is hardly an occasion for thrill." She smiled. "Perhaps not. Yet one must admit, it is in human nature to take a certain lively interest in the misfortunes of others, especially when they happen so very close to home." The truth of her words was evident in the days that followed. Everywhere there was talk. Some whispered the dead man had been a blackmailer, others that he was an abandoned husband come to seek revenge. A few, more practical, suspected robbery, though his watch and purse had not been taken. Miss Marple, meanwhile, busied herself with her knitting, her visits, her seemingly idle questions. She listened far more than she spoke, storing away each scrap of gossip, each contradiction, each evasive glance. And gradually, a picture began to form in her mind, not yet clear, but enough to trouble her. For she had recognized the handwriting in the notebook. Years ago, she had seen something very like it in a letter shown by her nephew Raymond. The hand belonged to a man of meticulous habit, precise in his records, yet careless in matters of the heart. That night, as she set aside her knitting and extinguished the lamp, Miss Marple murmured softly to herself, "The dead man came to Elmsworth with a purpose. He sought someone, or something, and found instead his death. The question is not only who killed him, but what he had discovered before the knife was driven home." The village slept uneasily, shutters drawn tight, doors bolted against the dark. Somewhere among them, a murderer moved freely, unsuspected. And only one small, sharp-eyed old lady truly began to see how the threads might be drawn together. Chapter 4: Rumors and Suspicions. The days following the stranger's death brought a subtle change to the atmosphere of Elmsworth. The crisp autumn mornings, usually marked by the cheerful sound of milk churns clinking and rooks calling in the elms, now seemed subdued. People lingered at their doors before venturing out, their eyes darting to see who might be passing. The air was filled not only with the scent of wood smoke but with something heavier, more intangible: fear. At the post office, letters and parcels were exchanged with whispered comments. At the baker's, loaves of bread passed from hand to hand alongside speculation. And at the village pump, where gossip always bubbled, the talk was of nothing else. "It's as I said," declared Mrs. Bantry, her shawl pulled tight about her shoulders as she leaned in confidentially to Mrs. Finch. "That man had business with Mrs. Lytton. Why else should her name be in his notebook? Mark my words, it'll all come out." Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. "Perhaps, Dolly. But I heard from young Mary Collins that he was seen walking near the rectory before the supper. Why would he go there, if his business was with Mrs. Lytton?" The theories multiplied, contradictory and colourful, until it seemed the entire village had a different version of events. Meanwhile, Inspector Cray pursued his inquiries with his usual blunt efficiency. He questioned the stationmaster, the innkeeper again, and even the milkman's boy, but though details emerged, the stranger had indeed arrived by the evening train. He had not taken a room at the inn. He had spoken to no one in particular. Nothing revealed why he had chosen Elmsworth, or how he had come to die beneath the oak tree. Miss Marple, however, had her own quiet ways of seeking information. A call upon the vicarage, ostensibly to bring some quince jelly, provided her with an opportunity to observe Mrs. Pritchard's anxieties. "You cannot imagine, Miss Marple," the vicar's wife confided, "how dreadful it is to have murder in one's very parish. I scarcely sleep at night. And the inspector, so abrupt. Why, he actually suggested that one of our parishioners might be involved." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "It is always a shock, dear Mrs. Pritchard. But people are people, whether in villages or in towns. Sin and folly do not stop at the gate. Still, I wonder, did you notice the stranger at the supper? He seemed to look for someone." Mrs. Pritchard frowned, knitting her brows. "Now that you mention it, yes. When he came in, he glanced about as if expecting recognition. And then, oh, it sounds silly, but I fancied he gave a little start when his eyes fell upon Mrs. Lytton. Of course, I may be mistaken." Miss Marple smiled gently. "It is often in the small impressions, not the grand ones, that truth lies hidden. Thank you, dear, you've been most helpful." Later that same day, Miss Marple encountered Mr. Carter, the rather solemn clerk from the solicitor's office in the next town. He had come to deliver some papers to the vicar but lingered at the gate to chat with the villagers. "Dreadful business, this murder," he remarked. "But if you ask me, it's money at the root of it. Always is. I shouldn't be surprised if the fellow was mixed up in some kind of scheme." Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "You are quite right, Mr. Carter. Money often lies at the bottom of unpleasantness. But so too does love, or jealousy, or even pride." Carter gave her a doubtful glance. "All the same, I'd wager we'll find something in his papers. Mark you, I've seen many a respectable case where the hidden motive was a debt, or an inheritance, or some such thing." The following afternoon, Inspector Cray confirmed that the notebook's entries were being examined by experts in London. In the meantime, he had summoned Mrs. Lytton once again for questioning. She arrived at the constable's cottage, where Cray had established his temporary office, and stood tall and calm as she faced his inquiries. Yet beneath her composed exterior, Miss Marple detected strain. "You still maintain you never met this man?" Cray asked. "I do," she replied, her tone crisp. "My name in his notebook must be coincidence. Perhaps he intended to call on me for charitable work or for some introduction, but I assure you, Inspector, I did not know him." "And yet," Cray pressed, "several witnesses say he looked directly at you on the evening of the supper." Mrs. Litton's lips tightened. "People imagine things when they are excited. I can only repeat what I have said. I never saw him before." Miss Marple, who had contrived to bring a message for Constable Hicks and so lingered within earshot, noted carefully the slight emphasis Mrs. Litton placed on the word before. It was not the denial itself, but the hesitation within it, that drew her sharp old eyes. That evening, at the Bantry's drawing room, the matter was debated hotly over sherry. Colonel Bantry, bluff and forthright, declared it nonsense to suspect Mrs. Litton. The inspector's barking up the wrong tree. "If you ask me, the fellow was a foreigner, a spy perhaps. We'll have the War Office down here before long." His wife snorted. "Nonsense, Arthur. Spies don't attend harvest suppers. He was after someone, and I still say it was Mrs. Litton." Miss Marple merely smiled into her knitting. She had learned long ago that arguing with Dolly Bantry only fixed her more firmly in her opinion. But in her mind, she was already turning over other possibilities. Who was Mrs. L if not Mrs. Litton? Could the initial stand for another name altogether? And why had the man chosen the harvest supper, of all occasions, to appear? It was not the action of one who wished to remain unnoticed. No, he had come deliberately, at that moment, in that place, to meet someone. The question remained, who had wished that meeting never to be spoken of again? As the fire crackled in the Bantry's hearth and Dolly chattered on about the stranger's appearance, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Her eyes, half hidden behind her spectacles, were far away, searching through the tapestry of village life for the thread that would lead her to the truth. For she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that somewhere among the whispers and rumors lay the small, overlooked fact that would unravel everything. Chapter 5. An Unexpected Visitor. The murder had already become the defining event of autumn in Elmsworth. Where once the talk had been of ripening apples and winter preserves, now every conversation, at the baker's, the post office, the church porch, returned inevitably to the dead stranger. Each telling gained new details, each listener supplied fresh speculation. The air of suspense was like a fog that would not lift. It was on the third morning after the discovery of the body that something new occurred, an incident that stirred the village as deeply as the murder itself. Mrs. Finch, who presided over the post office with solemn authority, was the first to witness it. A motor car, rare enough in Elmsworth to draw every eye, came rattling down the narrow lane and drew up outside her shop. Out stepped a young woman, no more than 25, dressed in a travelling coat of good cut, though dusty from the road. She had the look of someone accustomed to the city rather than the country, and she glanced about with a mixture of hesitation and determination. Mrs. Finch, who prided herself on never being at a loss, came to the doorway at once. "Can I help you, miss?" The young woman's voice, though quiet, carried a certain firmness. "Yes. I'm looking for Inspector Cray. I believe he is conducting inquiries here." Word spread like wildfire. Within minutes, a cluster of villagers had gathered at a discreet distance, peering from behind hedges and garden gates as the young woman was directed to the constable's cottage. Miss Marple, who happened to be returning from the grocer's with a small parcel of tea, observed her passage with keen interest. The set of the girl's jaw, the nervous tightening of her hands on her handbag, spoke volumes to the old lady's practiced eye. Here was someone with a burden, perhaps of guilt, perhaps of fear, perhaps of knowledge too heavy to carry alone. At the constable's cottage, Inspector Cray received her with brusque politeness. "You wish to see me, miss? May I have your name?" "My name is Clara Harwood," she replied. "I believe the man who was killed here. I believe he was my uncle." The words caused a stir that ran through the village like a ripple across water. An identity at last. The stranger was no longer a nameless figure, but a man with family, with connections, with a life that stretched beyond Elmsworth's borders. Inside, Clara Harwood explained further. Her uncle's name was Samuel Harwood, a man who had once been in business in London but who had, in recent years, grown estranged from much of the family. He was a difficult man, she admitted, her voice faltering. Quick-tempered, sometimes harsh. But he was not without kindness. I cannot believe he is dead, and in such a way." Cray questioned her closely. Did she know why he had come to Elmsworth? She hesitated. "Not for certain. But he wrote to me, only last week, saying he intended to visit someone here, a lady. He did not give her name, only that she was Mrs. L. I begged him not to go. I had a feeling." Her voice caught, and she pressed a hand to her lips. Cray leaned forward. "A feeling that no good would come of it. He had enemies, Inspector. He was," she glanced down, as though ashamed to speak ill of the dead, "involved in matters best left unspoken. There were quarrels, accusations. He made a fortune once, and lost it. People do not forgive such things." Miss Marple, who had been admitted by virtue of her long-standing friendship with Constable Hicks and her unassailable reputation for harmless helpfulness, sat quietly in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly. She did not interrupt, but her eyes rested thoughtfully on Clara's strained face. It was not what the girl said that interested her most, but what she avoided saying. Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize the evasions of youth, and she felt certain that Clara Harwood was holding something back. When the interview ended, Clara rose to leave. "I shall remain at the inn," she said. "I must make arrangements for my uncle's funeral. Poor man. And if there is anything I can do to assist, Inspector, you have only to ask." As she passed Miss Marple, their eyes met briefly. Something in the girl's look, a mixture of appeal and apprehension, lingered with the old lady long after she had gone. That evening, over tea with Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple spoke of the encounter. "Mark my words, Jane," Dolly declared. "The girl knows more than she's saying. Family always do. I wouldn't be surprised if she's at the bottom of it herself." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Dolly, you always think of the most dramatic possibility first. No, I should say she is frightened rather than guilty. Frightened of what her uncle knew, or perhaps of what he had threatened to reveal." "And you think it has something to do with Mrs. Lytton?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Perhaps. Or perhaps with someone else entirely. But one thing is certain, Mr. Harwood did not come here by chance. He came with a purpose, and his death is the result of it." Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, scattering the first leaves across the lanes of Elmsworth. Within, the little parlor glowed with lamplight, the fire crackling cheerfully. Yet for all its homeliness, Miss Marple felt the stirrings of unease. The arrival of Clara Harwood had shifted the pattern. The threads of the mystery, once loose and tangled, were beginning to take shape. And though the picture was not yet clear, Miss Marple sensed it was one that would draw them all deeper into danger than they yet imagined. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Ledger. The following morning dawned clear and bright, a deceptive beauty that seemed at odds with the grim events unfolding in Elmsworth. Clara Harwood had taken up residence at the village inn, and her presence there became the talk of the hour. Young, fashionable, and carrying an air of quiet sorrow, she was an object of sympathy to some, suspicion to others, and curiosity to all. Miss Marple, passing by the inn on her way to call upon Mrs. Lytton's gardener about chrysanthemums, observed Clara through the window of the parlor. The girl sat with a notebook open before her, writing intently. Every so often she paused, bit her lip, and stared into the middle distance as if haunted by thoughts too heavy for her youth. At the same time, Inspector Cray pursued his inquiries with renewed vigor. From London had come the first report on Samuel Harwood. Once a prosperous merchant in textiles, later ruined by speculation, he had left a trail of broken partnerships and accusations of fraud behind him. In recent years, he had lived in reduced circumstances, traveling often, his affairs increasingly obscure. "Not a man to inspire trust," Cray remarked grimly, spreading the papers upon the constable's desk. "A swindler, if ever there was one. No doubt he made enemies enough to fill a book. But what brought him to Elmsworth, that's the sticking point." Constable Hicks scratched his head. "Could it be he was after money, sir? From this Mrs. Lytton, perhaps." "Could be," Cray admitted. "But we'll need more than gossip." It was then that Miss Marple, who had dropped by with a basket of quinces for Mrs. Hicks, observed the papers laid out upon the desk. She made no attempt to intrude but allowed her eyes to rest for the briefest moment on one particular sheet, a page from Harwood's personal ledger, recovered from his London lodgings. Neat columns of figures, names abbreviated, sums entered and crossed through. But what caught Miss Marple's sharp gaze was a small note scrawled in the margin, E. £200, settled. She thought quietly to herself as she continued on her way. Now what could that stand for? Later that day, Clara herself sought out Miss Marple, approaching her in the garden where the old lady was pruning roses. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" she asked, her voice low, her eyes darting nervously toward the lane. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, setting aside her shears. "Come and sit here. It is easier to talk among flowers than in crowded rooms." Clara seated herself, twisting her gloves in her lap. "I hardly know why I've come. Only, you seem so kind, and so understanding. I cannot talk freely to the inspector. He would think me foolish. But I must tell someone." Miss Marple listened with her usual patience as the girl's story unfolded. Her uncle, she said, had been estranged from the family for years. He was unpredictable, sometimes cruel, yet capable of sudden generosity. He wrote to me because he trusted me more than the others. He said he was coming here to confront a woman who had wronged him. He would not give her name, but he hinted that she had once been involved with him in business, and that she owed him a very great deal. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you fear that this woman, whoever she may be, had reason to wish him silenced?" Clara shivered. "Yes. I cannot help but fear it. And, forgive me, but I wonder if Mrs. Lytton is that woman. My uncle mentioned once a Mrs. L. years ago. A lady in London. I cannot believe it is mere coincidence." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Coincidences, my dear, are not so frequent as people suppose. But one must be cautious. Many things may appear linked that in truth are not. Still, it is wise to speak of your fears." That evening, Miss Marple reflected on the girl's words as she knitted by the fire. The ledger entry, £200, settled, returned to her mind. It might be nothing, or it might be the key. For Miss Marple had long since learned that debts, financial or otherwise, were often at the root of tragedy. The next morning, she called upon Dolly Bantry, who was delighted to resume speculation. "Jane, I'm certain of it now. Mrs. Lytton knew the man." "Why, didn't young Clara all but admit as much? The poor girl's terrified. I wouldn't be surprised if Mrs. Lytton lured him here and then." "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "one must not jump ahead of the facts. You may remember the case of Mrs. Edgeworth, who was accused of poisoning her husband when all she had done was to give him too much plum wine." Dolly snorted. "You always think the best of people, Jane. But mark my words, Mrs. Lytton's at the heart of this." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was busy. For even as Dolly spoke, Miss Marple recalled another villager whose name began with E, Edward Carter, the solemn clerk she had encountered only days before. Could there be a connection between him and Harwood's note? That night, Elmsworth seemed wrapped in silence, the lanes dark under the waning moon. Yet behind its cottage windows, secrets stirred, uneasily kept. And Miss Marple, though she could not yet see the whole pattern, felt the threads drawing tighter. One thing she knew for certain: the dead man's ledger was not merely a record of debts. It was a map, and someone in Elmsworth feared very much that Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, might learn to read it. Chapter 7. A Whisper at Dusk. Elmsworth, for all its charm, had never been a place where secrets could remain buried for long. Yet now, in the wake of Samuel Harwood's death, secrets seemed to seep from every hedgerow and cottage, whispered in drawing rooms, exchanged in hurried tones at the pump, or carried from door to door by the tireless tongues of the curious. It was on one such evening, as dusk settled over the village and the air grew chill, that Miss Marple, walking home from the vicarage, overheard a conversation that caused her to pause among the shadows of the lane. Two figures stood near the churchyard gate, half hidden by the yew trees. One was unmistakably Clara Harwood. Her fair hair caught the faint gleam of the fading light. The other was a man, tall, shoulders bent slightly forward in an attitude of urgency. Miss Marple recognized him after a moment as Edward Carter, the clerk she had seen visiting the vicar. Their voices were low, but in the stillness of the evening, certain phrases carried. "You should not have come," Clara whispered. "If anyone sees us." "No one will," Carter interrupted, his tone tense. "But you must tell me everything. What did your uncle leave behind? Did he mention my name?" Clara's reply was inaudible, but the agitation in her manner was plain. She wrung her hands, then looked anxiously about her, as though fearful of discovery. "Then we're both in danger," Carter said grimly. "If the inspector learns the truth." A sound from the lane, a dog barking, startled them both. Carter broke off, glancing around sharply. "Go back to the inn," he muttered. "We mustn't be seen together again." And with that, he strode off toward the green, leaving Clara standing pale and uncertain by the gate. Miss Marple slipped quietly into the shadows and continued on her way, her mind alive with thought. Carter and Clara Harwood, what bond could link them? Why the secrecy, the fear? And what truth did they dread the inspector discovering? The next morning brought renewed activity. Inspector Cray, growing impatient with the villagers' evasions, summoned Mrs. Lytton once more. This time, his questions were sharper, his manner more severe. "Mrs. Lytton," he said, pacing the constable's little parlour, "you still deny ever knowing Samuel Harwood. And yet evidence accumulates that suggests otherwise. He had dealings in London, business dealings, and your late husband's name has been mentioned in connection with him." Mrs. Lytton's composure wavered. Her hands, gloved despite the warmth of the room, tightened upon her handbag. "My husband," she said stiffly, "was acquainted with many men in business. If Mr. Harwood was among them, I cannot say. But I had no dealings with him myself." Cray pressed further. "You deny that he came here to see you?" "I deny it absolutely." Her eyes flashed. "This persecution must stop, Inspector. I will not have my name dragged through village gossip because of a man I never met." Miss Marple, who had once again contrived to appear with a message for Hicks's wife, observed quietly from the background. She noted the colour that had risen to Mrs. Lytton's cheeks, the tremor in her voice, and, most tellingly, the sudden glance she cast toward Clara Harwood, who had entered just then to make some inquiry of the constable. It was not a glance of recognition, but of something keener, alarm. That evening, the Bantrys entertained a small gathering, as was their habit when excitement ran high. Over sherry and seed cake, the murder was dissected for the 100th time. Colonel Bantry remained convinced of foreign intrigue. Dolly was certain of Mrs. Lytton's guilt, the vicar inclined toward robbery by a passing tramp. Miss Marple listened politely, her needles clicking, her eyes lowered. At last she said, very mildly, "I do not think it was a tramp. Tramps, you see, rarely carry ledgers, nor do they arrive by train with tickets properly purchased. And as for foreign agents, spies do not usually attend harvest suppers." Her companions laughed, but Dolly leaned forward eagerly. "Then who, Jane? Who do you suspect?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Oh, my dear, it is much too soon for suspicions. But one learns, over the years, that the truth often lies not in the loudest declarations but in the smallest silences." She did not elaborate, but her thoughts returned again and again to what she had seen by the churchyard gate, Clara and Carter whispering in the dusk. A young woman burdened with secrets, a man with something to hide, and both united by fear of discovery. When she went to bed that night, Miss Marple reflected that human nature was very much the same in Elmsworth as in St. Mary Mead, or indeed anywhere else. People were driven by vanity, by greed, by love, and by fear, and it was in those motives, not in wild theories, that the solution would be found. And somewhere among the villagers, one person carried the weight of guilt too great to be hidden forever. Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and unassuming manner, meant to see that it was revealed. Chapter 8. The Gardener's Gossip. Morning sunlight slanted across Elmsworth, glinting off dewdamp hedges and catching the smoke from cottage chimneys. In the calm of the village green, it might almost have seemed that life was unchanged, yet beneath the surface unease rippled. Every villager now moved with an extra glance over the shoulder. Every conversation bent sooner or later to Samuel Harwood's murder. Miss Marple, walking to the market with her string bag neatly folded, paused near the vicarage wall where two gardeners leaned on their spades, exchanging low words. Gardeners, she had often observed, were repositories of a very useful kind of knowledge. They worked quietly, unnoticed, and heard much from those who believed themselves unobserved. "Strange business," said the elder of the two, a wiry man with a cap pulled low. "Strange indeed. He was seen near the orchard gate that very evening, you know. Mr. Carter, I mean." The younger man nodded. "Aye, and him saying he'd no dealings with the dead gentleman. But I've eyes, haven't I? Saw him speaking with that London lady's niece. Sharp words, too, though she tried to hush him." Miss Marple, head slightly inclined as if admiring the dahlias over the wall, let the words sink in. So, the gardeners, too, had noted Carter's behavior. That confirmed her own observation of the encounter by the churchyard. Later, at the market, tongues wagged more freely. Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, leaned across her stall to confide to anyone who would listen, "Mark me, it'll come out that Harwood was blackmailing someone. Men like that always are. He had the look of a man who knows too much." Mrs. Bantry, arriving in her usual flutter of chatter, seized on this. Blackmail? Why, of course. That explains it all. He must have had some dreadful hold over Mrs. Lytton, and when he threatened exposure, she— "Now, Dolly," Miss Marple interjected mildly, "let us not jump to conclusions. Blackmail is indeed common enough, but one must be very sure before laying so grave a charge. Sometimes what appears blackmail is merely the repayment of an old debt, or a quarrel revived after many years." Nevertheless, the suggestion clung to the air of Elmsworth. Blackmail, the very word seemed to thrill the villagers with a mixture of fear and excitement. That afternoon, Inspector Cray called upon Miss Marple, more in frustration than courtesy. "You've a way of learning what people won't tell me, Miss Marple. Perhaps you can explain why Edward Carter grows paler every time I mention the dead man's name. He swears he never spoke with Harwood, yet half the village places him near the orchard on the night in question." Miss Marple regarded him over her spectacles. "Perhaps because he fears being thought guilty, Inspector. It is often the innocent who most dread suspicion. And yet, I believe Mr. Carter is keeping something from you. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear." Cray snorted. "Fear of what?" "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is the question we must ask ourselves." Meanwhile, Clara Harwood's position grew more precarious. She remained at the inn, but her every step was noted, her every purchase gossiped over. Some pitied her as a bereaved niece, others hinted darkly that she knew more than she told. A young woman from London, attractive and alone. Such a figure was bound to excite speculation. It was late in the day when Miss Marple encountered her again, walking slowly by the river path, her face pale. "My dear," said Miss Marple kindly, "you are tiring yourself with all this worry. You should rest." Clara shook her head. "I cannot. I feel as though everyone is against me. They think I had some part in it, and I swear to you, Miss Marple, I did not." Miss Marple laid a hand on her arm. "I do believe you, child. But you are concealing something. A connection, perhaps, or a secret your uncle entrusted to you." Clara hesitated, lips parted, then pressed them tightly together. "I cannot say. Not yet. If I spoke, it might ruin another. And I have promised." Promises, Miss Marple reflected as she walked homeward, had often led people into dreadful danger. Clara's silence was no protection, rather, it made her vulnerable. And Edward Carter's involvement, half seen, half suspected, tied another knot in the tangled skein. That evening, as lamps were lit in cottage windows and the sound of the church bell drifted over the fields, Miss Marple sat knitting by her fire. The pattern emerging on her needles was neat, ordered, inevitable, the very opposite of the confusion surrounding Harwood's death. Yet she felt, as surely as she had ever felt in her long life, that the truth too was a pattern, waiting to be discerned. Already, certain threads gleamed brighter, the ledger with its cryptic entries, the secrecy between Clara and Carter, the nervous glances of Mrs. Lytton. And overlaying it all, the insistent murmur of the village, blackmail. Blackmail, Miss Marple murmured softly to herself. Yes, but who was the blackmailer, and who the victim? The firelight flickered on her composed features. Outside, Elmsworth settled into uneasy slumber. But for Miss Marple, the case was far from sleep. The whispers of the gardeners, the fears of the niece, the evasions of the clerk, each was a stitch in a fabric she meant to finish, however tangled the skein might appear now. And when it was finished, she knew, the design would reveal not merely the hand that struck Samuel Harwood down, but the hidden passions that had driven it. Chapter 9. Shadows in the Vicarage. The vicarage at Elmsworth was ordinarily a place of peace, where the roses rambled unchecked along the garden wall and the air indoors always smelled faintly of polished wood and pipe smoke. But in the days following Harwood's death, even its quiet refuge seemed touched with unease. Reverend Miles, mild and scholarly, had done his best to calm his flock with words of reassurance from the pulpit. Yet he himself looked troubled, and his wife, a practical woman, complained that the household was plagued by questions, gossip, and, more unusually, unexpected callers. Miss Marple, arriving one afternoon under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly, found Mrs. Miles in a flutter. "My dear Miss Marple, you cannot think what a strain it is. People knock at all hours, some wishing to unburden themselves, others seeking reassurance. And Edward Carter, I hardly know what to make of him. He comes at odd times, asking to see my husband privately. Yesterday evening, they were closeted together for nearly an hour. He looked pale as death when he left." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. "Indeed. And did Mr. Carter say what troubled him?" "Not to me. He is a reserved young man, too reserved, if you ask me. But my husband insists he is merely conscientious, burdened with parish accounts." Mrs. Miles sighed. "Still, I cannot help but feel there is more on his mind than ledgers." Miss Marple made a soothing reply, but her thoughts were active. Ledgers again. Always these ledgers, Harwood's, with its cryptic initials, and now Carter's parish accounts. A coincidence? Or something more? As if in answer, later that evening, the Reverend himself mentioned the matter. They were having tea together, and Miss Marple had steered the conversation, gently, as was her way, toward the subject. "Carter is devoted to his duties," said the vicar earnestly, "but I fear he carries some private burden. He asked me, in confidence, whether sins of dishonesty might ever be forgiven if confessed. I assured him, of course, that forgiveness is open to all who repent. Yet I could not but wonder what weighed so heavily upon him." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. "Sometimes, dear Reverend, what a young man calls dishonesty may not be quite what one expects. It might be a false step in business, or perhaps, silence when he ought to speak." The vicar looked startled. "You think he knows more than he has told the inspector?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that he knows something which frightens him. And fear, as you must have observed in your parish, is very often more dangerous than guilt." Meanwhile, Clara Harwood remained the subject of endless speculation. Some villagers claimed to have seen her walking by moonlight in the orchard the night of the murder. Others insisted she had received letters, mysterious, sealed envelopes delivered by hand. When confronted with such gossip, Clara grew pale and shook her head, denying all. Yet one evening, as Miss Marple passed the inn, she glimpsed Clara hastily tucking a folded paper into her handbag before the landlady could notice. The girl looked up, caught Miss Marple's eye, and flushed crimson. Another secret, Miss Marple thought. Another thread in the tangled skein. Inspector Cray, for his part, grew more determined than ever to pin matters on Mrs. Lytton. He came to see Miss Marple, perhaps in the hope of gaining her agreement. "She lied to me, that woman," he declared. "I've checked with records in London. Her late husband did business with Harwood. She knew it, and she tried to deny it. Why, then, if not to cover guilt?" Miss Marple folded her hands primly. There are many reasons why a lady might choose to conceal knowledge of a man like Harwood. He was not, as I understand it, a gentleman of irreproachable character. A respectable widow might fear gossip or the suggestion of impropriety, even if none existed. Cray scowled. "You always see the innocent side, Miss Marple. But I tell you, this case smells of money, debts unpaid, threats made. Blackmail, if you ask me." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Very likely, Inspector. And yet one must still ask, who was blackmailing whom?" That question lingered in her mind as she returned home through the darkened lanes. At the vicarage, Carter had spoken of dishonesty. At the inn, Clara concealed her letters. At the Lytton house, the widow trembled at the mere mention of Harwood's name. So many shadows, each falling across a different life. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, shadows have one useful property: they point to the light that casts them. She reached her cottage, lit her lamp, and sat down once more to her knitting. The needles clicked softly, like the steady beat of her thoughts. Somewhere among these villagers lay the truth. And she, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, intended, however gently, however patiently, to bring it into the light. Chapter 10. A Second Shock. The morning broke with a strange stillness, as though Elmsworth itself held its breath. For nearly a week, Samuel Harwood's murder had dominated every thought, and though the villagers pretended to go about their ordinary lives, the atmosphere was taut with unspoken dread. Yet no one could have foreseen that a second blow was about to fall. It was Dolly Bantry who first brought the news, arriving breathless at Miss Marple's cottage with her hat askew. "Jane, you'll scarcely believe it. Edward Carter is dead, dead. They found him not an hour ago in the vestry at the church." Miss Marple looked up sharply from her knitting. "Dead? But how?" "They say poison," Dolly whispered, eyes wide with mingled horror and relish. "A cup of tea left on the vestry table. He must have drunk it last night. Oh, Jane, isn't it dreadful? 2 deaths in less than a week, and both tied to that horrid man Harwood, I'll be bound." Within the hour, Inspector Cray confirmed the particulars. Carter had indeed been discovered slumped across the vestry table, an untouched plate of bread beside him and a half-empty cup of tea. The doctor pronounced it poison, swift, certain, and deliberate. "It's too much of a coincidence," Cray declared grimly. "The man lied about knowing Harwood. I believe he was involved in Harwood's affairs, perhaps even his killer. And now someone silenced him before he could speak." The theory spread swiftly, and with it a new terror. If there was one murderer in Elmsworth, might there not be 2? Or was the same hand responsible for both deaths? No one could feel safe. Every cup of tea, every plate of food became suspect. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the vestry as the inspector examined the scene, noticed the little things others overlooked. Carter's ledger lay open beside him, entries neatly written, though one page had been hastily torn out. His fingers were stained with ink, suggesting he had been writing shortly before his death. And on the floor, half hidden by the leg of a chair, lay a small scrap of paper, crumpled and overlooked by the constable. Miss Marple stooped, apparently to adjust her shoe, and retrieved it. Later, in the privacy of her sitting room, she smoothed it open. Just a fragment of a note, scrawled in a hand not Carter's. "Cannot remain silent. The truth must come out. E." Miss Marple folded the scrap away carefully. "So," she murmured, "Edward Carter meant to tell the truth. But someone feared what that truth might be." Clara Harwood, when told of Carter's death, was stricken. She wept openly, confessing at last to Miss Marple that she had indeed met him in secret. "I was so afraid," she sobbed. "My uncle wrote that I could trust no one but Edward. He knew things, about Uncle's business, about the people he dealt with. He promised to help me, to protect me. And now he's gone." "Did he tell you what he knew, my dear?" Miss Marple asked softly. Clara shook her head. "Only that Uncle was not merely ruined, he was ruined by others, by deceit. And that one of those responsible lived here, in this village. But he never said who. He wanted to be sure first." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently upon her. "And the torn page from his ledger, did he ever show it to you?" Clara's gaze flickered. "No. But I think he meant to. He asked me to meet him again, tomorrow evening, in the church. He said he would bring proof." The old lady's needles paused mid-stitch. Proof, and now Carter was dead before he could share it. The page torn from his ledger might well have been that proof. And if so, someone had killed him not merely to silence him, but to destroy evidence that might condemn them. That night, Miss Marple lay awake long after the village had gone to sleep. Her mind moved steadily, like her knitting needles, fitting each piece into place. 2 deaths now, linked by ledgers, by secrets, and by fear. The pattern was becoming clearer, though not yet complete. She thought again of Mrs. Lytton's trembling denial, of Clara's whispered confidences, of Carter's burdened conscience. She thought, too, of the villagers' eagerness to believe in blackmail. Blackmail indeed, but was Harwood the blackmailer, or the blackmailed? And if Carter had held the proof, who most feared its revelation? When morning came, Miss Marple was no nearer to sleep, but her resolve was firm. The key, she felt sure, lay not in speculation but in the small overlooked details. The missing page, the initials in Harwood's ledger, the frightened glance between widow and niece. And she, Jane Marple, would see to it that those details were not overlooked again. Chapter 11. The Niece Under Suspicion. The news of Edward Carter's sudden death spread through Elmsworth with the speed and relish of wildfire. The villagers, already unsettled by one murder, now found themselves whispering in tones of awe and dread. 2 deaths, so close together, and both touched by the presence of Clara Harwood. At the grocer's, at the pump, even in the pews before morning service, Clara's name was murmured. Some said she had been seen slipping into the church on the very night Carter died. Others claimed she had quarrelled with him in the lane only hours before. Still others declared she had inherited a sum of money from her uncle and feared Carter meant to expose her. Inspector Cray, never one to disregard the force of village opinion, summoned Clara to the constable's office. She sat there pale and trembling, her hands clenched tightly together as though she might still the shaking by force of will. "Miss Harwood," Cray began, stern and deliberate, "you admit to meeting Carter in secret. You admit he had knowledge of your uncle's affairs. What are we to conclude, except that you feared he might accuse you? And now he is dead, poisoned. Can you explain how you came to be seen near the vestry on the very night of his death?" Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She seemed paralyzed, caught between fear and despair. At last she stammered, I went to meet him, yes. He had promised to give me something, a paper. But he never came. I swear it, Inspector. I left before midnight, and he was alive then. I never touched him, I never." Cray leaned forward. "And this paper he promised, what was it?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "Proof. Proof that my uncle was not what everyone believes. But now it is gone, destroyed, perhaps with him. Oh, can't you see? I am as much a victim as anyone." Cray remained unmoved. "Your word is thin protection, Miss Harwood. Until we know more, you remain under close watch." It was at this moment that Miss Marple, who had appeared with her usual air of apologetic helpfulness, interjected. She had been ostensibly delivering a basket of plum jam to Constable Hicks's wife, but had contrived to hear enough of the exchange. "Inspector," she said mildly, "I do not think Miss Harwood is our murderer. In my experience, when young women commit desperate acts, they rarely choose poison. Poison, you see, requires patience, planning, and above all a coolness of nerve that is uncommon in the very young. Their crimes, when they occur, are more often impulsive, born of passion." Clara looked at her with wide, tearful eyes, as though clinging to a lifeline. Cray scowled. "You've a way of defending the unlikely, Miss Marple. But the facts remain. Carter's dead, and she was there." "Facts," Miss Marple murmured, "are stubborn things. Yet they can sometimes be arranged in a misleading order, like pieces of a jigsaw set down in the wrong place. One must be very cautious in assuming they mean what they seem." That evening, Clara returned to the inn, her reputation more battered than ever. The landlady, though outwardly polite, served her supper with a stiffness that could not be mistaken. Other guests watched her with sidelong glances. Clara bore it in silence, though her hand shook as she lifted her cup. Miss Marple, visiting her later under the pretext of inquiring after her comfort, found the girl seated alone by the fire, her face drawn. "They will never believe me," Clara whispered. "I feel as though I'm being hunted. Even the inspector, he wants me guilty, I can see it in his eyes." Miss Marple sat beside her, her voice gentle. "People are often quick to condemn, my dear, especially when they are frightened. But truth is not so easily smothered. If Carter meant to give you proof, then proof must exist somewhere. We need only find where he concealed it." Clara looked up, hope flickering faintly. "But where? His room at the vicarage has been searched, his papers taken. Everything is gone." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Not everything. Men like Edward Carter, reserved, conscientious, often keep their secrets very near at hand. We must think where such a man would hide something he valued. Not in the obvious places, but somewhere linked to his daily routine. That is where we must look." The following morning, Miss Marple took herself to the church under the pretext of arranging flowers. Alone in the vestry, she examined the room with quiet patience. Her gaze lingered not on the large desk or the drawers already ransacked, but on the small, neglected details. A hymn book left slightly askew. A loose floorboard by the lectern. A dustless corner where something had recently been removed. At last she found it, slipped inside the lining of Carter's worn satchel, still hanging from its accustomed peg. A folded half-sheet of paper, written in his neat hand. Not the missing page itself, but a copy. Miss Marple read the words with pursed lips. Harwood demanded repayment. Threatened exposure. Paid by E. £200. Further sums promised. Cannot continue. The initials again. E always E. Miss Marple replaced the paper with care and departed the church as quietly as she had come. The evidence was growing, but in whose favour, and against whom? That evening, the village buzzed anew. Clara Harwood was whispered of not merely as a suspect, but as a dangerous one. Some said she would be arrested within the week. Others feared she might attempt flight. Only Miss Marple, sitting serenely at her window, remained calm. For she knew, with the certainty of long experience, that Clara was no murderess. The pattern was not yet complete, but when it was, the stitches would form a design quite different from what the inspector imagined. And somewhere, in the darkened cottages of Elmsworth, the true murderer watched the village turn its suspicion upon the helpless girl, and perhaps believed themselves safe. But Jane Marple, knitting patiently in her quiet parlour, thought otherwise. Chapter 12. The Widow's Silence. For several days following Edward Carter's death, Mrs. Lytton kept to her house. The tall windows of the Lytton residence, usually bright with polished glass and lace curtains, were now shuttered. Servants ran errands in hushed voices, and callers were received at the door with firm refusals. It might have seemed to outsiders a gesture of grief or delicacy, but in Elmsworth, the silence only fanned speculation. "She's hiding something," declared Mrs. Price at the grocer's. Mark my words, she knew that man Harwood. Her husband, too. Why else would she keep so close indoors, unless she fears what people may say? "She's afraid, that's what," Dolly Bantry told Miss Marple over tea. "Afraid the inspector will come pounding at her door again. And between ourselves, Jane, I can't help but think she's guilty. A woman like that, always so composed, why, it's just the sort to break out in violence when her past comes back to haunt her." Miss Marple smiled gently but said nothing. She had long since learned that human nature did not divide so neatly into the respectable and the criminal. Often, the two existed uncomfortably side by side. Inspector Cray, convinced by village gossip and his own instincts, called upon Mrs. Lytton at last. Miss Marple, with her usual unobtrusive persistence, contrived to accompany him under the guise of delivering flowers from the church bazaar. Mrs. Lytton received them in her drawing-room, pale and elegant in a dark gown. Her hands were folded in her lap, though the faint tremor of her fingers betrayed her composure. "Madam," Cray began without preamble, "we now have evidence that your late husband conducted business with Samuel Harwood. Harwood came to Elmsworth to demand money. He mentioned a Mrs. L., and I think we may both agree who that must be. What I want from you is the truth." Mrs. Lytton's lips tightened. For a moment she said nothing. Then, with a sudden movement, she rose and went to the mantelpiece, resting her hand upon it as though for support. "Yes," she said at last, her voice low. "My husband knew him. Years ago, in London. They entered into certain ventures together, ventures that ended badly. My husband was deceived, ruined. And Harwood, he threatened us. He claimed we owed him money. But it was he who cheated us. Do you understand? He preyed upon our good name." "Yet you denied ever meeting him," Cray pressed. "I denied it because I feared scandal," she retorted with sudden vehemence. "My husband is dead, his reputation all I have left. I will not see it dragged through the mud by that man's dealings. Yes, Harwood came here. Yes, he tried again to extort me. He demanded £200. I gave it to him, for the sake of peace. But I swear to you, I never wished him harm." The room fell silent. The inspector looked grimly satisfied. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were thoughtful. "Mrs. Lytton," she said gently, £200 is not a small sum. Did you not fear that Harwood, having succeeded once, would return again and again?" Mrs. Lytton's gaze faltered. "Yes. I feared it deeply. That is why I wished never to see him again." Cray leaned forward. "And yet, madam, not only is Harwood dead, but Edward Carter too, who knew something of these affairs. Can you explain that?" Mrs. Lytton's composure crumbled. She sank into her chair, covering her face with her hands. "I cannot explain it. I only know I am innocent." Miss Marple, her gaze fixed quietly on the widow, noticed something then, the slightest flicker of the eyes toward the escritoire at the far side of the room. A glance so quick it might have passed unnoticed, but not by Jane Marple. Later, as they departed, Cray remarked, "She's admitted enough to hang her, near enough. Blackmail, payment, motive as clear as day." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Motive, perhaps. But clarity, Inspector, is not always truth. I think Mrs. Lytton tells us some of it, not all." That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She thought of the widow's trembling hands, of Clara Harwood's desperation, of Carter's unfinished confession. The initials in the ledger, E, might stand for Lytton's late husband, Edward by name, or for Edward Carter himself, or for something else entirely. The pattern was growing more complex, not less. Yet Miss Marple's instinct told her that the truth was drawing nearer. For in Elmsworth, the villagers had begun to reveal themselves, not in their words but in their silences, their evasions, their frightened glances. And Jane Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching human nature unfold in the smallest of ways, knew that sooner or later, one of those silences would betray the hand that killed. Chapter 13. The Weight of Gossip. Elmsworth had always prided itself on being a peaceful, respectable village, where disagreements seldom went further than a raised eyebrow at the Women's Institute or a squabble over allotments. But now, with 2 deaths unsettled and no arrest made, gossip took on a venomous life of its own. In the snug at the King's Arms, voices carried over pints of ale. "It's the niece," said old Mr. Tradewell firmly. "I saw her myself near the church that night. Poison, too, that's a woman's weapon if ever there was one." "No, no," countered Mr. Sims, the butcher. "Mark my words, it's the widow. Harwood bled her dry, and when Carter started poking about, she silenced him too. Money makes folk do dreadful things." At the post office, Mrs. Price hissed behind her hand, "Why, I shouldn't be surprised if Clara Harwood and Mrs. Lytton were in it together. 2 women cornered by the same man. They could have planned it between them." By the 3rd day, suspicion had grown so wild that even Dolly Bantry, who had a tendency toward fancy, shook her head in dismay. "Jane, if this goes on much longer, they'll be accusing the vicar next, or poor Mrs. Pritchard who only ever minds her roses. It's becoming unwholesome." Miss Marple agreed. Gossip, she knew, could be as deadly as poison, destroying reputations before the truth had a chance to breathe. And yet, gossip also had its uses. For in the careless exaggerations of village tongues, small truths often slipped out, truths unnoticed by those who repeated them. That afternoon, she paid a quiet visit to Constable Hicks, who had been set the unenviable task of keeping order at the inn where Clara Harwood lodged. He was flustered, but eager to confide. "It's a bad business, Miss Marple, and no mistake. The girl looks fit to drop. Folks glare at her in the street. She won't last under such pressure. And between you and me, there was something odd about Carter's room at the vicarage when we cleared it. A drawer locked fast, but empty when forced. Like someone had got to it before us." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "How very interesting, Constable. And when you say empty, was it quite bare? Or did it bear signs of having contained something recently?" Hicks scratched his head. "Now you mention it, dust at the corners, but none in the middle. As though a bundle of papers had lain there, not long removed." Miss Marple thanked him and returned home, her thoughts busy. Papers removed. A missing ledger page. A widow's nervous glance toward her escritoire. And Clara, adrift in a sea of suspicion, too fragile to bear the weight of it. That evening, a storm broke over Elmsworth, rain lashing the windows and wind howling down the chimneys. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting untouched, listening to the tumult outside. A storm often unsettled people, she reflected. It shook loose their restraint. And indeed, it was during that storm that the next clue revealed itself. For as the church bell tolled the late hour, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Pritchard, came running to Miss Marple's cottage, her umbrella blown inside out, her face pale with fright. "Oh, Miss Marple. I hardly know how to say it. But while the storm raged, I heard a crash in the vestry. When I looked in, I found one of the cupboards forced open. And inside, this." She held out a small object, wrapped hastily in her handkerchief. Miss Marple unwrapped it with care. It was a fountain pen, heavy, gold-tipped, engraved with the initials S.H. Samuel Harwood. Mrs. Pritchard wrung her hands. It was hidden away behind hymnals, as though someone had thrust it there in haste. "Do you think it means?" Miss Marple said nothing at first. She examined the pen closely, noticing a faint smudge of ink on its cap, and a crack along the barrel as though it had been dropped. At last she said quietly, "I think, dear Mrs. Pritchard, that this pen may tell us who last saw Samuel Harwood alive. But we must be patient. The truth, like a rosebud, opens only when the time is ripe." When the vicar's wife had gone, Miss Marple sat long by the fire, the storm still raging beyond her window. The pattern was clearer now. Harwood had been silenced because of what he knew, Carter because he sought to reveal it. The pen, the missing papers, the evasions of both Clara and Mrs. Lytton, all were pieces of a larger design. And though the villagers clung to their gossip, pointing fingers this way and that, Miss Marple knew in her heart that the true culprit was none of those most loudly accused. It was someone quieter, more careful, whose hand guided the pattern from the shadows. The storm began to abate. Miss Marple folded her hands and whispered softly, "Soon, very soon, they will show themselves." For storms always leave wreckage in their wake, and in wreckage, one finds what has been hidden. Chapter 14. A Village Turns. The storm had left Elmsworth washed clean in appearance, but not in spirit. Mud clung to the lanes, branches littered the green, and puddles lay wide as ponds at the village crossroad. Yet beneath the clear morning sky, the villagers carried themselves with the restless energy of those who had been stirred and unsettled. In the snug at the King's Arms, the talk was sharper, louder, more bitter. Edward Carter's death had unsettled everyone, and Samuel Harwood's murder remained unsolved. Fear bred suspicion, and suspicion, given a voice, soon became accusation. "It's the girl," said Mr. Tradewell for the third time that week. "Clara Harwood. Everyone knows she was skulking near the church. The inspector's soft, that's the trouble. If he won't arrest her, then we mustn't be surprised if there's another death yet." "Aye," muttered Sims, the butcher. "And I'd not like to see who's next. Poisoners don't stop at one victim." At the post office, Mrs. Price whispered to her neighbor, not quietly enough, "The huss's got it in her, you can see it in her eyes. It's always the ones who look innocent that turn out wicked." By evening, gossip had grown to such a pitch that even the landlady at the inn hesitated before serving Clara her supper. Clara, pale and exhausted, pushed the plate aside untasted. She had taken to keeping to her room, but the whispers followed her even there. A chambermaid muttered as she passed, and the scrape of chairs in the parlor below carried words she could not quite catch, though she needed no clarity to know they were about her. On the fourth night after Carter's death, matters came to a head. Clara, unable to bear the confinement, slipped out into the twilight for air. She had not gone far along the lane when a knot of villagers emerged from the pub. Their voices were thick with ale, their faces ruddy, their words sharp. "There she is," one cried. "The poisoner." Clara froze, her breath catching. "Best keep an eye on her," said another, "or we'll all be next." Someone else muttered something harsher still, and before Clara quite knew what was happening, the small crowd had begun to press closer, their voices jeering, their eyes hard. It was not violence yet, but it was perilously close, the kind of mob cruelty born not of reason but of fear. And then, quite suddenly, a small, firm figure appeared between them. "Good evening," said Miss Marple pleasantly, as though addressing a tea party. "I trust you are not intending to frighten a young lady on her evening walk? It would be most unchivalrous, and very un-English." The crowd faltered, embarrassed. Mr. Tradewell cleared his throat. "Now, Miss Marple, no harm meant. Only we don't want another murder." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Nor do I. And I can assure you that Miss Harwood is in no position to harm anyone. In fact, she has been very much in danger herself. One ought always to consider, you know, that those who shout the loudest are often the least guilty." Her gentle reproof, delivered with the authority of age and respectability, had its effect. The group muttered apologies and dispersed, leaving Clara shaken but unharmed. Miss Marple slipped her arm through the girl's and guided her back to the inn. "You must not wander alone just now, my dear," she said softly. "Fear makes people unkind, and unkindness, unchecked, may turn cruel. But remember, it is not truth they speak, only their own dread-given words." Clara clung to her. "If it weren't for you, Miss Marple, I think they would have—" She broke off, unable to finish. "Hush, child," said Miss Marple kindly. "Courage is not in resisting fear, but in continuing despite it. And you have courage, though you may not know it." That night, after seeing Clara safely settled, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She lit her lamp and sat down with her knitting, but her hands did not move. Instead, she thought long and carefully. The pen marked SH hidden in the vestry. The missing page from the ledger. The widow's frightened glance toward her escritoire. And now the village, so eager to condemn the innocent, that they might turn their eyes from the guilty. She had seen such things before, though in smaller matters: the pilfering maidservant accused by a jealous co-worker, the wayward nephew blamed for the theft his uncle had committed. Human nature was a pattern, repeating itself endlessly in small variations. And here, too, the pattern was clear. Gossip was not merely noise, it was cover. Somewhere in those whispers, someone hid their relief that suspicion had turned elsewhere. Someone, very likely, was nudging the crowd's suspicion forward, encouraging it with subtle hints and murmured suggestions. Miss Marple closed her eyes. Yes. She thought she knew the kind of person who would do such a thing. The guilty often betrayed themselves not by their actions, but by the way they urged others to believe in another's guilt. The next day, she would begin to listen differently. Not to what was said about Clara, but to who most eagerly said it. For if Jane Marple had learned one truth above all others in her long life, it was this: when people protest too much, they usually have a reason. Chapter 15. Whispers in the Dark. The next morning dawned bright, with a crispness in the air that promised autumn's approach. Yet despite the freshness of the day, the village still carried the heavy aftertaste of the previous night's near-ugliness. Clara Harwood remained within the safety of her room at the inn, while villagers, embarrassed by their behavior but unwilling to admit it, muttered defensively over their errands. Miss Marple, meanwhile, set out on her customary walk with her basket, stopping here and there to exchange a word at the grocer's, the post office, the baker's. She had no particular purchases in mind. Her true business was listening. It was at the grocer's that she first noted the pattern. Mrs. Price, who had been so forceful in her condemnation of Clara, now mentioned, quite by chance, of course, that she had heard from Mr. Sims at the butcher's that Mrs. Lytton had been seen in close company with Harwood before his death. At the baker's, Mrs. Copley repeated the same tale, only her version came straight from Mrs. Price. By the time Miss Marple reached the post office, the story had grown a little more detailed. Harwood had not only met Mrs. Lytton, but argued with her violently in the lane. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. It was precisely as she had suspected. Gossip in Elmsworth, like ivy on a wall, did not grow wild without guidance. Someone had been watering it, directing it, ensuring that suspicion leapt neatly from one target to another. Clara yesterday, Mrs. Lytton today. Who, then, stood to benefit from such convenient shifting of blame? That evening she found Dolly Bantry waiting with news. "Jane, you'll never guess. One of Carter's missing papers has turned up." "Indeed, dear Dolly? How very fortunate." "Fortunate, or suspicious, if you ask me. It was found tucked behind the vestry clock. The sexton swears he never put it there. But there it was, plain as daylight, a page torn from that ledger. It lists a payment of £200, initials beside it, E.L. "Edward Lytton," Miss Marple said softly. "That's what the inspector thinks," Dolly declared. "He's certain now. Samuel Harwood must have been blackmailing poor Mrs. Lytton over her late husband's dealings. And Carter found out. No wonder she wanted it hushed up." Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She turned the matter over in her mind, the way she might examine a knot in her knitting before deciding whether to unpick it. "Curious," she murmured at last. "Curious that the page should appear now, when all the rest are missing. As though someone wished it to be found." The following day, Miss Marple called quietly upon Mrs. Lytton. The widow received her with evident strain. Her hands trembled as she poured the tea. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "the village is buzzing with dreadful things. They are saying your husband was not the man everyone believed." Mrs. Lytton's eyes filled with tears. "It is true," she whispered. "Edward made mistakes, grave mistakes. He invested with Harwood, and when it all collapsed, he borrowed money to cover it. I thought it all behind us, but Harwood returned, demanding more. He threatened exposure. Edward paid him once. I paid him again, after Edward's death. I wanted only to protect my husband's name." Miss Marple laid a kind hand upon hers. "And yet, my dear, truth has a way of slipping out, no matter how one tries to keep it hidden. But I do not think you are a murderess." Mrs. Lytton looked at her in startled relief. "You believe me?" "I do," Miss Marple said simply. As she walked home, Miss Marple reflected. Edward Lytton's weakness for risky ventures, Harwood's threats, the widow's payments, these were true enough. But truth alone was not guilt. The question remained, who had gained by both Harwood's and Carter's silence? That evening, Miss Marple paused at her gate to exchange a word with young Tommy Briggs, the paper boy. Tommy, eager to share a secret, confided, "I saw Mr. Sims talking with Mr. Tradewell the other night, just before the shouting started at the pub. He was saying Clara had better be watched, else she'd poison half the village. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Then they all took it up." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "How very instructive." For in that moment, she saw the pattern a little more clearly. Gossip was not merely wild talk. It was guided, encouraged, repeated by the same voices until it gained the force of truth. Someone was playing the village like a fiddle, nudging suspicion first toward Clara, then toward Mrs. Lytton. Someone who understood that the easiest way to hide guilt was to ensure that others quarreled among themselves. Miss Marple went inside, set down her basket, and settled to her knitting. The wool slid smoothly through her fingers, stitch by careful stitch. Outside, the village murmured with its ceaseless chatter. But Jane Marple, with her quiet eyes and steady needles, knew she was closer now than ever to the hand that plucked those strings of gossip in the dark. And soon, very soon, that hand would betray itself. Chapter 16. The Puppet Strings. The days that followed were cooler, with a faint mist rising from the meadows each morning. Yet the air in Elmsworth was anything but calm. Rumours still darted from lip to lip like swallows over water, first about Clara, then about Mrs. Lytton, now circling back again as though the village itself could not decide which story it preferred. But Miss Marple had noticed something others had not. The same names appeared at the centre of each new wave of talk. Mr. Sims, the butcher, with his ready laugh and loud voice, old Mr. Tradewell, always quick to declare he knew more than most, and Mrs. Price at the post office, whose relish for scandal was second only to her efficiency in spreading it. It was not unusual for these three to chatter. What was unusual was the precision with which their tales shifted. First Clara, then Mrs. Lytton. The changes came neatly, like the turning of a page. And that, Miss Marple thought, suggested a guiding hand. That evening, under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly, Miss Marple lingered by the butcher's shop. Mr. Sims was speaking with Mr. Tradewell in the doorway, his voice lowered but urgent. "Best keep it up," Sims was saying. "The girl won't last long under the strain. Inspector'll have to act soon, or folk'll demand it. Safer that way, for everyone." Tradewell nodded, casting a nervous glance around. Miss Marple, apparently fussing with the string of her parcel, was overlooked. She walked on, her mind sharper than her outward air of mild confusion suggested. Why would Sims and Tradewell be so invested in pressing suspicion? Unless, of course, they had something to lose if the truth strayed too close. The following day, she made a point of calling upon Dolly Bantry, who had a knack for drawing confidences from people without meaning to. "Dolly dear," Miss Marple said lightly over tea, "have you noticed how very much Mr. Sims talks about the murders? More than is quite usual for a man in his line of work, don't you think?" Dolly pursed her lips. "Now you mention it, yes. Always full of opinions, that one. And did you know he was in some sort of scheme with Harwood years ago? My gardener told me. Something about cattle prices. Sims lost money, I believe, but whether Harwood tricked him or not, who can say?" Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. How very enlightening. People who have once been tricked seldom forgive or forget. That evening, Miss Marple went for her customary walk past the church. The vestry door stood ajar, and she saw Constable Hicks within, fussing over a pile of papers. "Good evening, Constable," she said mildly. "Still searching." Hicks looked flustered. "Inspector's orders, Miss Marple. He wants every corner checked. And look here, another of Carter's notes turned up, tucked into a hymn book. Odd thing is, it makes no sense to me." He handed her a slip of paper, half faded with ink. It read, "Sims insists. Cannot go on. H. to be settled soon." Miss Marple read it twice, her lips pursed. "Most curious," she said at last. "One wonders what exactly Mr. Sims insisted upon. But I dare say the truth will out." She handed the note back, thanked the constable, and walked slowly home. The path was becoming clearer. Samuel Harwood had returned to Elmsworth not merely to menace Clara and Mrs. Lytton, but because there was unfinished business with Sims. And Carter, discovering it, had been silenced before he could reveal too much. At her gate, Miss Marple paused to watch the evening fall. Lamps glowed in the cottages, and smoke curled from chimneys. The village looked peaceful once more, yet beneath that surface lay fear, secrets, and a hand pulling the strings of gossip to misdirect suspicion. Miss Marple sighed gently. "The trouble with puppets," she murmured, "is that sooner or later the strings become visible. And when they do, one sees very plainly who holds them." She went inside, set down her basket, and reached for her knitting. The pattern of stitches grew beneath her fingers, neat and inevitable. So too did the pattern of the crime. And though she had not yet the whole design, she felt certain of one thing: the butcher's hands were not as clean as he pretended. But she must move carefully now. For when the guilty sense that suspicion has drawn near, they can become very dangerous indeed. Chapter 17. The Butcher's Smile. Mr. Sims's butcher's shop was as familiar to the villagers as the church tower. Its windows gleamed with joints of beef, rows of sausages, and strings of bacon, all neat, all spotless. Behind the counter, Mr. Sims himself was a large, ruddy man with a booming voice and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. On a brisk morning, Miss Marple entered the shop with her basket. She was greeted with the usual joviality. "Good day, Miss Marple. Finest chops in the county, and a cut of beef that'll make your mouth water. What can I tempt you with today?" Miss Marple smiled benignly. "Only a small portion of mutton, if you please. For 2 meals only. I find I cannot manage larger joints these days. Age, you know, makes one cautious about waste." As he busied himself with the knife, she remarked casually, "Such dreadful business about poor Mr. Harwood and Edward Carter. One can hardly believe it, and yet here we are." Sims's knife paused fractionally before resuming. "Terrible, yes. Though I don't doubt the inspector'll have it sorted soon. Everyone knows who's to blame." "Do they, I wonder?" Miss Marple said softly, her eyes mild. "So many stories fly about. Some say Clara Harwood, others Mrs. Lytton. Why, even the vicar's wife told me she had heard a very different tale, one that pointed to old quarrels among the tradesmen of the village." Sims gave a short laugh, but it rang a little too loudly. "Tradesmen? Nonsense. Harwood wasn't mixed up with honest folk like us. He was a scoundrel, preyed on ladies, from what I hear." Miss Marple tucked her mutton carefully into her basket. "Ah, but one must be careful, mustn't one? I have always thought that gentlemen who meddle in money matters often leave behind resentments. Unpaid debts, failed ventures, such things have a way of festering. Why, I recall in St. Mary Mead, there was a poulterer who—" She allowed the story to trail into one of her rambling anecdotes, but her sharp eyes did not miss the flush that had crept into Sims's cheeks. He wrapped the parcel too quickly, as though eager to end the conversation. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple recounted the visit to Dolly Bantry. "He was uneasy, Dolly. Oh, he covered it well enough with bluster, but uneasiness is unmistakable. People who are innocent seldom fear being suspected, they simply protest their innocence. But those who are guilty, they are forever trying to direct suspicion elsewhere." "Do you mean Sims killed Harwood?" Dolly asked in astonishment. "My dear, I mean only that he had reason to wish him gone. Whether he acted upon that reason remains to be seen. But Carter's note, Sims insists, H to be settled soon, seems very plain, does it not?" That evening, Miss Marple contrived to walk past the butcher's again. Through the half-drawn blind she saw Sims counting money from the till, his brow furrowed, his lips moving as though in calculation. He paused once, glancing around nervously before locking a small drawer at the back of the shop. Miss Marple did not linger, but she had seen enough to confirm her suspicion. Sims's dealings with Harwood had not been confined to cattle prices long ago. Something more recent and more dangerous bound them still. The next day, she paid a quiet visit to Inspector Cray. "Inspector," she said, "you must not be too hasty in following the village talk. I believe there is another angle to this affair, one that concerns Mr. Sims." Cray looked skeptical. "The butcher? He's full of talk, yes, but harmless enough." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Harmless men rarely feel the need to spread stories quite so diligently. "And did you know, Inspector, that Harwood once dabbled in the cattle trade? Mr. Sims was involved. There were losses. Perhaps unpaid debts. Harwood, I fancy, came to collect, and Sims, like Mrs. Lytton, found himself unwilling to pay. The difference is, Sims is not a gentleman, nor a widow fearful of scandal. He is a practical man, and practical men sometimes take practical measures. Cray rubbed his chin, unconvinced but uneasy. If you're right, Miss Marple, we'll need more than stories. We'll need proof. Proof, Miss Marple said gently, has a way of surfacing when one sets the right bait. And I believe Mr. Sims is just the sort of man to betray himself when pressed. That evening, Miss Marple prepared her own quiet trap. At the Women's Institute meeting, she let fall, with apparent carelessness, a remark about papers hidden in the church vestry. Papers which, if found, might reveal the full truth of Harwood's dealings. The words were repeated, as she knew they would be, by Mrs. Price before the meeting had even ended. And when Miss Marple walked home under the stars, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. For if Mr. Sims had indeed hidden anything, the knowledge that someone might stumble upon it would surely unsettle him. And unsettled men make mistakes. Chapter 18. Midnight Errand. The night was cool, the sky washed with a pale half-moon that cast long shadows across Elmsworth's crooked lanes. Most of the village had retired, but a few lamps still glowed faintly behind curtained windows. Miss Marple sat in her armchair by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her mind was far from the pattern in her lap. She was waiting. The Women's Institute meeting had ended only hours before, and already she had seen the ripple her careless remark had caused. Mrs. Price, bless her eager tongue, had carried the story to half the village before supper was done. Now, if she was right, one man would find sleep impossible. At 11:30, she rose, donned her shawl, and stepped into the night. The village was hushed but not silent. The rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog, carried on the still air. Miss Marple moved quietly toward the churchyard, her steps unhurried, her figure blending easily with the hedgerows. She did not have to wait long. A lantern's faint glow bobbed along the lane, accompanied by the heavy tread of boots. Mr. Sims emerged, broad-shouldered even in the gloom, a key glinting in his hand. He glanced around once, twice, then crossed into the churchyard with surprising agility for a man of his bulk. Miss Marple, concealed behind the yew hedge, watched him unlock the vestry door and slip inside. The faint scrape of drawers followed, then the muffled thud of books displaced. She heard a muttered curse, sharp and frustrated. After some minutes, Sims reappeared, clutching a packet wrapped in brown paper. His face was set, grim with determination. He stuffed the packet into his coat and locked the door behind him, moving swiftly now, as though he feared discovery. Miss Marple allowed him to pass before stepping quietly into the lane. She did not follow, not too closely. Instead, she circled back by the mill path, knowing it would bring her behind the butcher's shop. There, beneath the dim light of the back window, she saw Sims enter, the parcel still in his grasp. She did not need to see more. The very fact that he had gone to such lengths confirmed what she had suspected. There was something hidden, something dangerous, that he feared might expose him. The next morning, she paid another call on Dolly Bantry, who listened wide-eyed as Miss Marple described the midnight errand. "My dear Jane, how daring of you! But what on earth do you suppose was in that packet?" "Papers, I imagine," Miss Marple said calmly. "Records of Harwood's dealings with Sims. Perhaps even letters. Men like Harwood are never content to threaten once. They like to have evidence, something to hold over their victims. It is a most imprudent habit, but a very common one among blackmailers. And Sims killed him to get rid of it all." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "It is not so simple. Remember, Edward Carter was killed as well. And I think poor Carter stumbled upon the truth. He knew too much of Harwood's affairs and intended to speak. That note of his was very clear. Sims insists. To be settled soon." Yes, Carter understood. And for that, he paid with his life. Dolly shivered. "Jane, you must tell the inspector." "In due course, dear. But Inspector Cray is a man who likes facts, not theories. We must let Mr. Sims provide the facts himself. The guilty often do, you know, when they believe themselves cleverer than those around them." That evening, Miss Marple positioned herself again in her garden, ostensibly pruning the last of the roses. From her vantage point she could see the comings and goings along the high street. At dusk, Sims appeared once more, locking up his shop early. He carried a small valise, the sort used for overnight travel. His manner was hurried, furtive. Miss Marple did not move. She watched him vanish down the road toward the station, her expression thoughtful. A hasty departure was always telling. But whether he sought to flee or to hide the incriminating papers elsewhere, she could not yet be sure. Later, she walked to the vicarage, where she found Inspector Cray conferring grimly with the vicar. She recounted what she had seen: Sims's midnight visit, the hidden parcel, the sudden attempt at departure. Cray's eyes widened. "By God, Miss Marple, if you're right, we may have him yet. I'll send a man to the station at once." Miss Marple inclined her head, satisfied. But as she made her way home beneath the starlit sky, her thoughts were not entirely at rest. For though she felt certain of Sims's guilt in Harwood's death, the matter of Carter still troubled her. Carter had been silenced too swiftly, too brutally. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing human nature, could not quite reconcile the boisterous butcher with the cold precision of that second crime. 2 murders, she murmured to herself, but perhaps not one murderer. Or perhaps... She let the thought drift away, unfinished. For now, she had seen enough. The trap was closing, and soon the village would know the truth, or at least, the first layer of it. Chapter 19. The Net Tightens. The news spread quickly through Elmsworth the next morning. Mr. Sims, the butcher, had been taken in for questioning. Villagers gathered outside the shop, whispering in scandalized tones as the constable fixed a notice to the door. Some professed astonishment, others nodded knowingly, but all agreed it was a shocking turn. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the little crowd, observed the faces more than the words. Some showed relief, the comfort of believing the danger past. Others betrayed unease, as though uncertain whether the right man had been caught. And then there was Mrs. Price, whose voice rang a little too loudly as she declared that she had always suspected Sims. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Mrs. Price had always suspected at least half the village by now. At the police station, Inspector Cray wasted no time. Sims sat glowering in the small interview room, his arms folded across his chest. "You were seen at the church vestry in the dead of night," Cray began. "You removed a parcel, which you attempted to conceal. You've long had quarrels with Samuel Harwood, and Carter's note clearly places you in conflict with him. What have you to say for yourself?" Sims's ruddy face grew redder still. "I'll tell you this, Inspector, Harwood was a rogue through and through. Yes, I owed him money, years back, but I'd paid my due. Then he turns up again, demanding more, threatening letters I kept. That's what I took from the vestry. Not murder, Inspector, self-protection. I wasn't about to have my name blackened with his lies." "And Carter?" Cray pressed. "Why should he write that you insist H must be settled soon?" Sims shifted uncomfortably. "Because I told him plain enough I wouldn't stand for Harwood's threats any longer. Carter knew more of Harwood's dealings than anyone. I asked him to speak to the man, to put a stop to it. But kill him? No, Inspector. I may lose my temper, but I'm no murderer." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, watched his every gesture. His anger seemed genuine, his fear real. Yet something pricked at her mind, something that did not fit neatly into place. After Sims was removed, Cray turned to her. "Well, Miss Marple, what do you make of that? Looks plain enough to me. The man had motive, means, and was caught red-handed hiding the very letters he claims to fear." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She folded her hands in her lap, her expression mild. "I think, Inspector, that Mr. Sims is telling the truth, or at least part of it. He feared Harwood, yes. He may even have wished him gone. But I do not believe he struck the fatal blow." Cray frowned. "But who else?" Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you notice, Inspector, how he spoke of Carter? He admitted speaking with him, asking him to intercede with Harwood. But Carter was not killed until after Harwood. That timing troubles me. If Sims had murdered Harwood to rid himself of blackmail, why silence Carter afterwards? Carter was no threat to him, unless, of course, Carter had seen something that pointed to the real murderer." Cray rubbed his chin uneasily. "You mean someone else altogether?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps Sims played his part in one crime, and another hand completed the work. It is not uncommon, Inspector. I once knew of a case where 2 quite different persons, unknown to each other, acted separately but were bound by the same victim. Human nature, you see, is rarely tidy." That afternoon, as Miss Marple walked home through the lane, she was hailed by Tommy Briggs, the paper boy. "Miss Marple, you know what? I saw Mr. Tradewell sneakin' round Sims's shop last night, before the police came. Looked like he was trying to peep through the shutters." "Did you indeed, Tommy?" Miss Marple said kindly, slipping him a sixpence. "That is most observant of you. You must keep your eyes open, they are very useful things." As she walked on, her mind ticked quietly. Tradewell again. He had been near when the first gossip against Clara spread. He had been in Sims's company on more than one occasion. And now, prowling about the butcher's shop. The inconsistency became sharper in her mind. Carter's death. A brutal silencing, more ruthless than Sims's bluster would suggest. Sims might be a man of temper, even desperation, but he was not subtle nor cunning. Someone else had ensured Carter's voice would never be heard. That evening, Miss Marple took a tea with Dolly Bantry, confiding her unease. "My dear Dolly, the village is content to think the matter solved. Yet I cannot help but feel that behind Mr. Sims's noisy guilt, another hand moves more quietly. One that knows the value of silence, and of letting another man take the blame." Dolly shivered. "You mean someone still free, out there in the village?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, gazing into her teacup. "And if I am right, that someone is clever enough to see that gossip, once stirred, can conceal a very different truth. But threads have a way of showing themselves, if one but looks closely. And I believe I see one now, faint, but enough to follow." Outside, the evening settled over Elmsworth. Villagers drew their curtains, comforted that the butcher sat under lock and key. But Jane Marple, sitting very still in Dolly Bantry's parlour, knew the story was not yet finished. The true murderer was still among them, and the final act was yet to come. Chapter 20. Carter's Last Walk. The morning sun slanted warmly across the churchyard, where dew still clung to the grass. Miss Marple stood with her parasol, gazing at the worn path that led from the vicarage to the LYCH gate. Few noticed paths as she did. They were like habits, telling, repeated, full of meaning. Edward Carter had walked this very way the night he was killed. The vicar had confirmed it. Carter left the vicarage shortly after 9, his notebook in hand, intending to visit the vestry once more. He never arrived. His body was found half an hour later, not far from the mill lane. Miss Marple closed her eyes, picturing it. Carter, eager, perhaps a little frightened, with notes that hinted at secrets. A figure following, not heavy-footed like Sims, but quieter, more deliberate. Carter would have stopped if he heard steps behind him. He trusted most of the village, after all. A word, a hand on his arm, and then, silence. She opened her eyes again. Sims, for all his faults, was not a quiet man. He blustered, barked, and blundered. He would never have coaxed Carter into stillness. No, it was another. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Dolly Bantry in her sunny drawing-room. "Dolly, I am beginning to think of Carter not as a victim of chance, but as the key to the whole affair. His death tells us what Harwood's does not." "How so, Jane?" Dolly asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Because Harwood's death may be explained by money, old quarrels, unpaid debts, blackmail. Many had reason. But Carter, he had only knowledge. Knowledge that threatened someone very directly. That someone followed him, silenced him. And we must ask, who benefited most from Carter's silence?" Dolly frowned. Sims, surely. He was already in danger of being exposed. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "But there is an inconsistency. If Sims were desperate enough to kill Harwood, why not destroy the incriminating papers outright, instead of hiding them in the vestry? Why risk their discovery?" Dolly's eyes widened. "You mean someone else put them there?" "Precisely. And when they reappeared, conveniently pointing to Mrs. Lytton, I asked myself, who would profit by such misdirection? Who has been nearest each new whisper, ensuring the tale shifts from one scapegoat to another?" Dolly gasped. "Tradewell." Miss Marple inclined her head. "He is at the heart of it. Always present, always murmuring, always nudging suspicion forward. And Carter's notes, who would have known their value, save a man who listened keenly, but never too much? Tradewell knew enough to realize Carter had stumbled on the truth. And for that, he ensured Carter did not speak again. That evening, Miss Marple made her way quietly to the mill lane, where Carter's body had been found. The air was still, the hedgerows thick with late summer growth. She stooped, studying the ground. The path was narrow, the soil still holding faint impressions of boots from many passings. But one set, broader and deeper, led away toward Treadwell's cottage. A neighbor's voice startled her. "Evening, Miss Marple. Looking for something?" She straightened with a mild smile. "Only admiring the hedgerows, Mr. Collins. They do grow thick this year, don't they?" Yet her heart beat faster as she walked away. She had not expected such clear evidence so soon. The broad prints, not Sims's, whose boot she had noted at the butcher's, but another pair entirely. Treadwell's. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting idle in her lap. She thought of Carter, earnest and honest, undone by the very quality that had made him valuable to Harwood, his curiosity. She thought of Sims, noisy and frightened, guilty of much but not of subtle murder. And she thought of Treadwell, sly, watchful, ever in the background, tugging the strings of gossip with patient malice. She sighed. It is like a play, where the loud actor draws all eyes, but the quiet one shifts the scenery behind the curtain. And when the curtain falls, it is the quiet one who has arranged the stage. The time for quiet watching was nearly over. Soon she would need to draw the curtain herself, and reveal to the village what had been before their eyes all along.